All right, we're about to dive into the story of one of history's most influential families. But we're not going to focus on the famous men you might have heard of. Nope, we're on the hunt for the hidden architect, the person who secretly drew up the blueprints for their entire legacy.
So, here's the big question. Who was the secret mastermind behind a family that would literally go on to shape Western thought for centuries? The answer isn't a king, it's not a general, and it's not even one of the famous male thinkers. It's someone who worked almost entirely from the shadows.
You know, the only reason we can tell this story is thanks to this one ancient text, a biography called The Life of Macrina. Now, the author, Gregory of Nyssa, was one of the most brilliant minds of his time. But this book, it isn't about him. It's a tribute to his older sister, the woman he called his teacher and his guide.
Okay, so let's finally meet this secret architect. Her name was Macrina the Younger.
Macrina was born around 330 AD. Her family was wealthy, powerful, the Roman elite. But she chose a path that was completely different. She became an ascetic, which basically means she gave up all worldly pursuits and dedicated her entire life to philosophy and teaching. And lucky for us, her little brother wrote it all down.
Her story really kicks off with her education, which was pretty unusual. And it leads to this one moment, this one decision that just completely changes the course of her life.
See, for a girl from an aristocratic family back then, education usually meant reading the great Greek and Roman myths and poetry. But her parents, they made a totally different call. They kept her away from what they saw as the drama and chaos of pagan literature. Instead, her entire curriculum was the Bible, books like Psalms and the Wisdom of Solomon. This wasn't just school, this was forging an entire worldview.
And that worldview gets put to the test almost immediately. At just 12 years old, she gets engaged in an arranged marriage. Standard stuff for the time. But then, tragedy strikes. Her fiancé suddenly dies. Now, for any other young woman, this would just mean she's back on the marriage market. But Macrina, she saw an opening.
She makes this totally radical choice, and her justification is just brilliant. She completely reframes the situation. He isn't dead, she argues. He's just away on a journey to God. And a good, loyal fiancé, she says, has to wait for him to return. With that one incredibly clever argument, she frees herself from ever having to marry. She seizes control of her own destiny.
So, what did she do with all that freedom? Well, she became the intellectual and spiritual center of gravity for her entire, very powerful family.
Macrina developed her own philosophy for living. She called it a higher philosophy, a commitment to a life free from ambition, wealth, and ego. I mean, think about it. In a Roman world obsessed with status and power, her path was a huge counterstatement. It was all about finding wisdom through prayer and deep thought. And this wasn't just for her. It was a blueprint she was about to roll out for everyone she knew.
And that's the thing about Macrina. She didn't just have big ideas. She was an architect. She actively started to redesign her family's world one person at a time.
Her method was super direct and personal. When her brother Basil came home from college, all puffed up with his own genius, she challenged him until he gave it all up for her higher philosophy. When another brother died, she helped her grieving mother not with simple platitudes but with powerful philosophical arguments about life and death. She personally educated her youngest brother Peter from the time he was a boy. And her masterstroke, she convinced her own mother to dissolve their entire aristocratic household and turn the family estate into a community for women ascetics.
You have to understand how wild this was. On her family's land, she built a whole new kind of society. All their wealth, gone, given away. Social status, completely erased. Her mother, the noble matriarch, was now living and working right alongside the family maids as total equals. It was a direct attack on the rigid Roman social structure. Their whole life was now about prayer, work, and the philosophical goal of getting rid of destructive emotions. She didn't just dream about a better world, she built a prototype.
The final chapter of her life became her ultimate lesson. In fact, her brother Gregory would later describe it as her final masterclass. A lesson in how a philosopher is supposed to die.
So, picture the scene. Gregory, who by this point is a famous and powerful bishop, has been away for almost a decade. He finally returns home, only to find his sister, his first and most important teacher, lying on a wooden plank on the floor, clearly in her final hours.
But this is no sad, tearful goodbye. Not even close. What happens next is just astounding. Macrina, in her final moments, turns to her powerful bishop brother and starts a deep philosophical debate.
She lectures him on the nature of the soul, the meaning of death, and the hope of resurrection. She is teaching while she is dying. And that conversation, it becomes the basis for one of Gregory's most famous books. She's not just facing death, she's deconstructing it for him.
So what is the legacy of this hidden architect? Well, it's nothing less than a philosophical dynasty that she designed from the ground up. The results of her mentorship are just staggering. The men she guided became known to history as the Cappadocian Fathers, 3 giants of Christian thought. Basil, the arrogant academic she humbled, went on to create the rules for monastic life and even invented the concept of public hospitals. Peter, the little brother she raised, became a bishop, and Gregory, her devoted student, became one of the most creative thinkers in history.
And that brings us right back to the blueprint. The core ideas, the spiritual discipline, the entire philosophical framework that let these men change the world, it all came from their sister. She was the source. She was the teacher. She was the architect who stayed behind the scenes.
And that leaves us with one final thought. We only know Macrina's story because her brother broke with tradition and decided to write it down. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If one woman's influence could be this huge and yet this hidden, how many other architects of history are still out there, waiting in the shadows for us to find them?